Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar delivered by White Ribbon called Building the Foundations for Healthy Relationships and Bystander Intervention. I'm Véronique Church-Duplessis, Bilingual Program Manager here at White Ribbon, and I will be leading the webinar this evening. Please forgive us for not having a webcam. The connection is sometimes unstable, so to make sure that we have a seamless webinar, we opted not to use the webcam today. First, before we begin, I would like to mention that although we're talking about the foundations of healthy relationships and bystander intervention today mainly, some of the content may be triggering or difficult for participants. We will be talking about gender-based violence prevention and sexual violence prevention. If you need some support and you need to reach out for help, please do so. I have highlighted some of the most common resources and sources of support in our communities. So remember that you are responsible for your well-being, and I encourage you to reach out and get help if you feel that is needed. So for those of you who are not familiar with White Ribbon is an organization that was founded in 1991 following the Montreal Massacre. White Ribbon works with men and boys to prevent gender-based violence by promoting equity and transforming social norms. We encourage men to take responsibility and be accountable and become part of the solution to end gender-based violence. The goals of today's presentation are pretty straightforward, so we're going to look a bit at gender norms and help use a critical lens when thinking about gender norms in our society. We're not going to go in depth into that topic today, but we will have an upcoming webinar on November 20th where we will look at that much more in depth. So I encourage you to sign up for that webinar if you're interested. The second goal is to understand the importance of bystander education and the importance of using a comprehensive approach to prevent gender-based violence, and understand why it's important to be proactive and preventative as opposed to reactive, and finally look at what men and boys can do to prevent violence against women and girls and other forms of gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is an umbrella term that we use to refer to all forms of violence that occur because of a person's gender. So we're looking at forms of violence that specifically target women and girls and LGBTQ folk. These people are targeted because of their gender identities. So that's the first aspect of gender-based violence. It's an umbrella term that does include various forms of violence, including sexual violence, physical violence, psychological and verbal violence, and economic violence. The second aspect of gender-based violence is that there's also a gender dynamic in terms of perpetration, with the vast majority of the perpetrators in these cases being men. Gender-based violence is really an epidemic in our societies. It has been recognized as such by the United Nations. So in Canada, for example, we're looking at about 1 in 3 Canadian women who will experience some form of sexual assault in their lifetime. In 2014 alone, there were more than 500,000 of sexual assaults in Canada. And some groups in our society are at much higher risk than average of experiencing sexual violence. We're talking about trans women and women with disabilities. Indigenous women and girls also face higher rates of sexual and gender-based violence in our society, and also young women. And that is important to remember as educators. Violence against women and girls does affect young people in our society. It is not an issue that only concerns adults, but rather it is present in our schools and everywhere, and it does impact our young people, and we have a duty to educate them so that they know how to recognize it and know how to get help if they experience or witness this type of violence. So there are several root causes for gender-based violence in our society. The first being gender inequality. So we're looking at thousands of years of legal, political, social, and cultural institutions that support the idea that men are superior and women are inferior. We've made some progress in that area over the last decades with the feminist movement, but this system of oppression is not likely to go away overnight and easily, so we have to be conscientious in our efforts to eliminate gender inequality in our society. The good news here is that most Canadian men and boys do believe that women and girls should be equal, but in practice, women in our society are still experiencing discrimination, and violence is one of the most severe forms of discrimination that women experience because of their gender. The second root cause is social learning. So we're looking at what we learn consciously or unconsciously about what it means to be a man or to be a woman or to identify otherwise in our society. So we're influenced by a variety of sources, including popular culture and media, but also our communities and schools and family. Part of what we are learning in our society is that discrimination and even violence against women and girls can be tolerated or ignored, or even that it is acceptable. So violent behaviors are behaviors that we have to unlearn. One of the last aspects and root causes of gender-based violence is harmful aspects of masculinity. So some norms and behaviors that are considered to be natural or good amongst men are in reality physically, socially, or even psychologically damaging. So there's nothing wrong with being a man in our society, and most masculine norms are not harmful, but there are some norms and expectations, including dominance, aggression, competition, self-reliance, and the devaluation of anything that is seen as being feminine, that are harmful, that are points at which masculinity goes from being something positive to something that is harmful. The last root cause of gender-based violence in our society is colonialism. So that's a violent system of oppression by nature. And it is rooted in domination and uses violence as a way to subjugate indigenous peoples. And over the last few centuries, colonizers in Canada have destroyed traditional family structures and indigenous practices concerned with gender in our societies, and residential schools and the Great Sweep in the 60s destroyed traditional family structures, and that's a legacy of trauma and violence. The good news is that violence is usually a learned behavior, so it means that it can be unlearned. Now, looking more closely at gender norms and how they contribute to violence in our society, very early on we are taught that being a man means one thing and being a woman means another thing, and that there are certain things that we should like because of our gender identity, certain ways that we should behave, and dress and present ourselves and build our relationships. And all of these can be very problematic. They can be very limiting, and they're problematic when they prevent us from being authentic and being our true selves. Now I invite you to connect to the webinar that we will have on the 20th, looking at healthy masculinities and healthy relationships. We will spend a lot more time unpacking healthy and harmful gender norms in that webinar. But before we move on and talk more clearly now about the connection between violence and harmful gender norms in our society, it is also worth noting that rigid gender norms also contribute to violence and discrimination, because they do not acknowledge that gender is not a binary, but rather it is a spectrum, it is a galaxy. There are very different types of gender identities in our society, and folks do not have to identify either as a man or as a woman. And when we put too much emphasis on this gender binary, we do a disservice to a wide variety of people in our society who do not identify as such. So we do not do justice to the gender galaxy. So as educators, I think it's important to take into account how very early on our young people are being influenced by what they think it means to be a boy or to be a girl or to be a man or to be a woman. And we have to be very conscientious in our efforts to counter those narratives and efforts to perpetuate stereotypes and traditional gender norms in our society. Studies have shown that we start ascribing gender roles and identities to children when they're newborn and even before. And traditional gender norms are still very present in popular culture, so we have to make an effort with our young people to tell them that they don't have to conform to those traditional gender norms, that they are free to be who they truly are, that if there are boys, they can be sensitive and caring, and that women and girls are not the only ones who can be sensitive and caring, that they can be affectionate, that they can be scared, and more importantly, that they can be vulnerable, that they don't always have to be so self-reliant, and that it is okay and important to get help when things are difficult and when you're struggling. And the same is true for girls as well. We have a duty to empower young women and girls to be who they truly are, to realize their full potential, and to break free of constricting gender norms. Now, one of the most important things that we can teach our young boys is emotional intelligence, and that also applies for women and girls. Everyone has to develop their emotional intelligence, but very early on, young boys and teenage boys get the message that to be a man means to not have or display many emotions, that it is important to be stoic, that it is important to be strong and to not cry. So as a result of that, a lot of young boys struggle with their emotional life, and often they repress emotions, particularly difficult emotions. So it's good to tell them that it is normal to experience a wide variety of emotions, including difficult emotions, and that vulnerability, those difficult emotions, does not make them weak, that it makes them human, and that it helps to talk about it. If you're interested in those little posters and images that I have here, they were made by Elise Gravel. You can see the links here on the right-hand side where you can download high-resolution images and put them up in your classrooms. Elise Gravel generously allows our teachers to print the resources and share them and use them in their classrooms. So going back to this idea of emotional intelligence, it's important to spend some time with our young people so that they develop those skills. Not only the ability to experience emotions, but also all three components of emotional intelligence, including acknowledging and accepting that we're experiencing a feeling or an emotion, the ability to express that emotion, and finally, the ability to manage that emotion in a constructive way. Using an emotions wheel is always helpful. Referring in our practice and our daily life to a wide variety of emotions, including difficult emotions, can help young people understand that it is normal to have and experience those emotions, and that it helps and it is useful to talk about it and not to keep them to ourselves. So that's the emotions wheels are also easily accessible online if you want to add them to your classroom. It's sometimes helpful to institute emotional check-ins to see how everyone is doing and allow and create a space um, where your students and your friends can share how they're feeling. And that we do normalize talks about emotions for our students, including our male students in our society. And it's important to do so because if we're not able to manage difficult emotions in a constructive way, that can result in aggression and violence. So the Gottman Institute developed this anger iceberg graphic. Once again, you can download that image for a classroom if you wish to. There's the link on the right-hand side. So basically what happens is that when we have trouble dealing with difficult emotions, including humiliation, embarrassment, feeling guilty, feeling regret, what happens is that we tend to fall back on the one emotion that we feel comfortable with, the one that doesn't put into question our gender identity. So if you're a man, no one will say that you're less of a man if you say that you're angry. But if you admit that you feel humiliated or embarrassed, your peers might question your masculinity a bit more. So developing our emotional intelligence and our ability to accept and acknowledge and have constructive ways of dealing with difficult emotions is essential, because without that skill, we fall back on anger. And anger, when it is not properly managed, can also lead to violence, including gender-based violence, but also interpersonal violence with other men. Another thing that we need to start working on with our students at a very early age is their relationship skills. And we're not only talking about intimate relationships here. It's important that students develop the skills they need to build healthy relationships with themselves, with their families and their friends, and eventually with their romantic or intimate partners. And they need to start developing those skills at a very young age. We know that harmful gender norms, including ideas about dominance and control, and the lack of good communication skills and the lack of emotional intelligence makes it difficult for young people, especially for young men, to establish and maintain healthy relationships. So if a young man is trying to conform to the ideals of dominance and control and stoicism, he will have a hard time developing healthy relationships, not only with his intimate partner, but also with himself and his friends and family. So when we're talking about healthy relationships, it's good to get our students to pause and think critically about what healthy and unhealthy relationships look like. It's a learning curve. It's not true that most of us are born with a natural ability to develop and maintain healthy relationships. Most people I know have had unhealthy relationships. The level of toxicity varied. Some of them are very unhealthy, others not quite as much. But truth is that being in an unhealthy relationship is an experience that most people will encounter in their life. So it's helpful to walk our students through scenarios similar to the ones that we've got on the screen right now, and ask them to pause and think critically about that relationship. Are there warning signs? Are there red flags in that relationship? What are the behaviors that are being exhibited? Does it conform? Is it in line with healthy or unhealthy relationships? And it's important to pause and also ask our students to think about how the people in this relationship, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, might be feeling, so that we're able to cultivate empathy in our students and get them to put themselves in other people's shoes and understand how a person in a toxic relationship might be feeling. So to help with that process, we have this, well, everyone has this healthy relationships wheel. It's a very common tool that you can also find online, looking at all the various parts of a healthy relationship. So it is based on equality, and there is no violence present in the relationship, and there are a wide variety of criteria and characteristics that we're looking at, that we're looking for in a healthy relationships, including non-threatening behavior, trust and support, the ability to connect with others, because it is not true that a person can find complete fulfillment in their relationship with only another person. We do need connection with other people, our families and our friends. And all of the meaning of our lives doesn't come only from one intimate partner, but rather it is important to cultivate meaningful, profound, and supportive relationships with people outside of a romantic relationship. Other characteristics include honesty and accountability. For adults, we're looking at responsible parenting and financial and economic independence. It's based on healthy relationships are also based on negotiation and fairness, and also on sexual safety, meaning that the people in the relationships are able to make decisions with regard to their sexual life that suit them. For young people, the YWCA Canada has developed a healthy relationship quiz that is quite handy because it doesn't look only at romantic relationships, but also at relationships with our friends and family, because these are also sometimes toxic or unhealthy. So if you want to access this, there's printable versions and online versions. The link is here on the right-hand side. So this is a good tool to help young people go through this checklist and see if their relationships are healthy and unhealthy, and help them consider all the aspects and the parts of healthy and unhealthy relationships and all the red flags, and think about what they can do if they are in an unhealthy relationship. And this work is needed for many reasons. One, because we are not born naturally with the ability to have good relationships, but two, because we also get pretty twisted or unhealthy messages from popular culture itself. Looking at the messages that very young people get, for example, if we look at Disney movies, first, the movies usually end with a happy ever after, with a wedding, and we leave the folks in that relationship there. I think that as adults, we all know that the start of a relationship is not the end of a story. Relationships are not easy. They're not always without difficulties, and they require work. So assuming that once you start a relationship, a romantic relationship with someone, that everything will be easy is not healthy. And it's important to recognize that relationships need work. The second problem with the Disney movies is that they perpetuate harmful ideas about gender norms, and also about how courtship should be. And we can extend that reflection to look at all the romantic comedies, movies, including a series of very unhealthy ones in the 90s and the 2000s, where, and the 80s even, where there's this idea that the whole movie revolves around the idea that you should pursue a woman until she agrees to go out with you, until she gives in, even if she says no at first. So it's a clear sign there of not respecting women's autonomy, their decision-making, their boundaries, and other problems with most relationships that we see in popular culture is that they're extremely heteronormative and they don't make a lot of space for LGBTQ relationships. Now, one aspect, one skill that we need to develop healthy relationships that we can start cultivating in young people at a very young age is the ability to recognize boundaries, to assert boundaries, and to respect other people's boundaries. So we're talking here about boundaries about personal space, boundaries about a person's body, and respecting people's bodily autonomy. So there are a variety of tools that we've developed to help explore boundaries with young people. And what's important to remember is that people's needs to feel safe and comfortable, their boundaries, they vary from person to person. Some people are huggers, they like hugs. Others are very uncomfortable. Other people are uncomfortable with any kind of physical contact except with their closest friends. So it's important for us to start cultivating the ability in our students to assert their own boundaries, but also respect the boundaries of others and recognize that others' boundaries might be different than theirs at a very early age. So if we look at the resource that I mentioned, so we'll get back to this Drawing the Line on Sexual Violence guide in a moment, but we do have 2 lesson plans here for primary and junior level students that do explore this question of shifting boundaries for people that you can implement in your classroom and start cultivating those skills in your students. And it's important to talk about boundaries and bodily autonomy with our students at a very early age because they're critical skills for them to later be able to practice consent. And consent doesn't have to be limited to sexual relationship, in fact, and shouldn't. Consent should apply to all aspects of our lives. It is a respectful and responsible way of conducting relationships with other people. The practice of asking for permission before touching another person's body, whether it's a hug or a more intimate contact, just as much as it is a good practice to ask permission from other people before you borrow their things or engage in a conversation. And this is needed because, as you see here, very few Canadians have a very good understanding of what consent means, and we have to start building the foundations of that knowledge early on. So when we're looking at consent, this Planned Parenthood graphic is pretty helpful. So there are several parts to consent. It's not no means no or yes means yes. It's only a freely given yes, an enthusiastic yes, a specific and informed yes, and a sober yes. That means yes, right? So consent cannot be coerced or manipulated. Consent is also reversible, so just because a person consents to one thing doesn't mean they consent to another thing. Just because a person consented at one time doesn't mean they consent at another time. And the person who's consenting knows what they're consenting to, so there's clear, specific, and informed consent here. And consent education is helpful because it allows bystanders to notice situations where a person is not consenting. As I mentioned earlier, sexual violence and gender-based violence affects youth and children. They are not, unfortunately, sheltered from those realities. So we have a duty to educate them about sexual violence and abuse, so that they know that if they're experiencing violence or abuse, they know that they're not alone, and they know who they could turn to for help. And if they are witnessing experiences of violence or abuse, they also know how they can help. They know not to ignore the signs when they see something problematic. So as part of the Draw the Line campaign, we developed a number of scenarios for elementary level students. So the two on the right here are the ones that we use for the primary level, and then with the junior and intermediate levels, we introduce the two scenarios here on the left. These things happen in our schools, and we're doing a disservice to our students if we are not breaking the culture of silence that often still surrounds sexual violence and abuse. And the whole goal of the Draw the Line campaign is to promote bystander education so that witnesses know what to do when they witness a situation that could be problematic or that very clearly is problematic. So bystander intervention. We focus on bystander intervention for a number of reasons. The first one being that the bystander is in a position to make a great difference when they choose to intervene to support a person who's possibly going to be victimized or a survivor of sexual violence. So a bystander is a witness, right? Someone who's close to the event and could be in the position to intervene and make a difference. And it's important to do some bystander education because we have to fight against some reflexes that we have in our society that go against bystander intervention. The first one being, oh, it's none of my business, it's a private affair. That's not true. Sexual violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, all of that are societal issues. They're collective issues, and they're not an issue that concern only the victim and the perpetrator. It's not a private matter. The second reflex that we have to dismantle or fight against is the idea that someone else will do something. So we're trying really to promote personal responsibility and accountability and encourage folks to make that first step and take responsibility and act, because they can make a very great difference. And we're not asking folks to be superheroes here. We're not asking them to put them at risk. Oftentimes, small actions and gestures will have a great impact. Showing support for a victim, offering to connect them with support services, all of these can make a great difference. And we look at bystander education because it also helps show our students and everyone in our society really that sexual violence is not an individual issue. It's not an individual issue that only concerns the perpetrator and the victim, but rather it is a collective issue, a societal issue. It is everyone's issue, and we all have a role to play, myself included, to prevent sexual violence and support survivors. So there are 5 steps, basically, to bystander intervention. The first one is the ability to notice that something's happening and then interpret what's happening as a problem. So being aware that a situation might be problematic. And make sure that, and being prepared when we see a situation that could be problematic, to investigate and pay more attention until we're satisfied that 1, it is a problem, or 2, it isn't a problem. And if it is a problem, then the 3rd step is to assume personal responsibility. And the 4th and 5th step are knowing how to help and implementing the actions that we determine would be helpful. And we need some practice. It's not true that folks know how to intervene. That in the spur of the moment, when there is a bit of anxiety and stress, we all know how to intervene and what to do. Most people don't. So it's important to practice the skills that you need so that when you do encounter a problematic situation, you know what to do. And that includes our students. It's important for them to practice and even play act and think about what they can do in a variety of situations so that they know if they're ever confronted with those problematic situations in their lives, and unfortunately it is likely that they will encounter those situations. So if they're confronted with those situations, they will know how they can act in a safe and effective way. So going back to the Draw the Line postcards that we had earlier, those are available online on our website, so at dtl.whiteribbon.ca, and you can also order print copies. So the front of the postcard presents a common scenario, and then on the back of the postcard, there are tips about what bystanders can do in a situation. So it highlights why the scenario on the front is problematic, why bystander intervention matters, when bystanders should intervene, and how bystanders could potentially intervene in safe and effective ways. And these that I mentioned are adapted to a young public. Our students' ability to intervene is, of course, much more limited than our ability to intervene as adults. They don't have the knowledge, the skills, or the support systems that we have as adults, and it's important to be realistic in terms of what they can potentially do. So oftentimes when we're talking about bystander education with young people, we're telling them to get help from people who may be in a better position to intervene, to check in with a person who might be in a difficult situation, and to connect with support resources and professionals who might be able to better respond to a situation. So really, we're not asking anyone to put themselves at risk. And when we're talking about bystander education and bystander intervention, when we're teaching this topic in our classroom, it's important to consider a number of things and to help our students understand that they have to consider a number of things before intervening. So first, it's about considering why you personally should intervene if you are a bystander who witnesses a problematic situation, and then consider when it would be best to intervene. So if there's an immediate risk, what can you realistically and safely do right now in the moment to prevent a situation? If there's no immediate risk, would it be better to approach a survivor or a perpetrator potentially at another time? Would there be a setting that would be more comfortable, more private, that would likely yield better results? And the last point is looking at how you can intervene, so that they have some ideas of actions they might take and what the consequences would be. So if this person I'm about to talk to, because they're possibly trying to take advantage of or assault a person who's intoxicated, so if I tell them not to do that, and if they yell at me, then I'll call for backup. So it's helpful for them to run through scenarios and really think about strategies and actions and ways that they can intervene and remain safe, right? Because we have to consider the risks when we're looking at bystander intervention, and we have to make sure that we are not putting our own safety at risk, and also consider the risks to our relationships. So if we're thinking about intervening in a situation where the person with the problematic behavior is our friend, that might put us in a bit of an awkward situation. Or if the person who has the problematic behavior is in a position of authority over us, we might fear some repercussions. So if we're looking at someone in a workplace and want to report harassment, we might fear being fired. If we're trying to call in our friends who have problematic behaviors, we might feel being ostracized by our friends. But with all of that considered, it's important to remember that intervening is still the right thing to do. Even if it's your friend, helping your friend avoid a really bad decision is the right thing to do. Being a stand-up friend and showing that you care about your friend enough to call them in when they're doing something wrong is the right thing to do. And one way of really hammering home the idea that intervening is the right thing to do is having your students reflect about the impacts of doing nothing versus the impact of doing something. What would be the consequences if we did nothing? So doing nothing is often portrayed as neutral in our society, and that's not the case. If we do nothing, we become complicit because we allow that violence to continue or to happen. But by doing something, at least we're becoming part of the solution. Small, caring actions can have a great impact. So things that don't require us to be a superhero and that can make a big difference include checking in with the person affected and letting them know that they're not alone and that you believe them, offering support and offering to get them some help, including some professional help, and simply listening and showing empathy sometimes also makes quite a bit difference. Now, when we're looking also at risks and safety and our ability to intervene in a situation, it's important to consider how our own experiences, our own identity affects our ability to intervene. So people who have more power or privilege, it's usually easier for them to intervene. They're not putting themselves at risk as much as people who are experiencing marginality or oppression. It is much harder for folks who are marginalized to intervene in situations because they are often putting themselves at greater risk than a person who has power or privilege. If we're looking at, for example, folks who are immigrants or refugees, or even folks who are here who are not citizens of this country, it is harder for them to intervene, especially in situations where they might get involved with law enforcement. It's riskier for them to take actions. So if you do have more privilege, it's easier to intervene, and it is your responsibility as well to do more and intervene when you witness situations of violence. And bystander education is very beneficial. It works. So very comprehensive bystander education programs have been shown to reduce incidences of gender-based violence, but also other forms of interpersonal violence. And the advantages and the benefits of bystander education are that it clearly shows that sexual violence and gender-based violence are everyone's issues. It uses realistic but provocative scenarios to help normalize conversations about sexual violence in our society, and helps survivors understand that they're not alone and that you are able and available to help them if they trust you enough to reach out for help. It helps also bystanders understand situations where there is no consent, and it helps youth gradually develop and practice the skills they need to intervene instead of looking away. So bystander education is an effective strategy to tackle sexual violence prevention and gender-based violence prevention. Now, there are other aspects that need to be combined with bystander education, so I invite you to tune in to our Healthy Masculinities and Healthy Relationships webinar at the end of the month, and to pay attention to the role modeling section of this webinar later on, coming soon. So now for we have developed a very comprehensive resource to help educators bring in bystander education into their classrooms. So we've developed this guide, this Draw the Line guide on sexual violence with experienced educators in Ontario, and it helps you bring bystander education in your classroom. It is proactive. It uses a proactive approach. It is based on real life scenarios. It does help you normalize conversations. And because it is bystander focused, it helps you engage all of your students. It clearly says that everyone has a role to play and that it is our collective responsibility to prevent sexual violence. And it helps challenge some myths about sexual violence that are still common, unfortunately, in our society and that are doing quite significant harm. So the guide includes, the guide is pretty comprehensive, and it includes an introduction to the topic of sexual violence, as well as information about the Draw the Line campaign. It also includes comprehensive suggestions on how to introduce this topic into your classrooms and lesson plans that draw on the Ontario curriculum, and not only the phys ed curriculum, but also for the elementary guide, we have curriculum connections with the language curriculum and the arts curriculum. And the guide also includes additional resources to support you and your students. Now, the lesson plans, they're very structured, and they are also adaptable to suit the needs of your students. They begin with a minds-on activity to help you create a safe space and prepare your students for the lesson, and then move on to step B, working on it, which helps your students reflect critically and practice the skills they need to respond to a situation of sexual violence. And they conclude with a consolidation exercise that reinforces the learning that has taken place during the lesson plan. We begin this work with very young students, so we begin in an age-appropriate way with students in grade 1. So young students develop the skills they need to stand up for themselves and assert their boundaries. Then they develop the skills they need to show respect for others and respect others' boundaries. And they develop the skills they need to trust their instinct and get help when things don't feel right, so that they don't look away when they see something that could be problematic. When we get to older students, particularly high school students, we're looking at understanding and applying the concept of consent, developing respectful, equitable, and healthy relationships, and being active bystanders and intervening safely and effectively to prevent sexual violence. So you can download a free copy of that guide on our website at dtl.ribbon.ca/elementary-guide. The link is here on the right. So that is a free resource for educators to use. So I encourage you to go and have a look at the guide. And if you require professional development for your colleagues, do get in touch and we can discuss that. The last part, since you're adults, educators, and role models, particularly for those of you who identify as men, really, I would encourage you to be a good role model, because young boys and young men do look to other men to determine what types of attitudes and behaviors are acceptable. They do look up to you to see what it means to be a man. And good role models can go a long way to counteract the impact of traditional stereotypes that we see everywhere in our society and that can be harmful. So we've developed a number of tools to help male educators, coaches, and fathers to be good role models and talk about gender equality, healthy relationships, consent, and sexual violence prevention with boys in their lives. And we have 2 online learning modules for the elementary and the secondary sector. So if you're a teacher, I encourage you to go to itstartswithyou.ca to consult those e-learning modules and see how you can integrate that learning into your classroom. There are a number of activities that you can use, as well as other curriculum connections. So I would like to thank all of you for participating today, and please help us improve. So I encourage you to fill our online survey and let us know how we can do better. And we really appreciate your feedback. So the link is here on the right. So please take a moment to fill the survey, and we really appreciate your feedback. As I mentioned, we have a couple of webinars coming up. So next week we have a webinar for secondary educators looking at healthy relationships and preventing sexual violence in the secondary sector. On November the 8th, we have a French webinar about sexual violence prevention as well. And as I mentioned earlier, on November 20th, we have our Healthy Masculinities and Healthy Relationship webinar, which will complement nicely today's webinar. So please go to dtl.whiteribbon.ca/for-educators to register, and we look forward to chatting with you then. Get in touch with us on social media, and you have my email here. I encourage you to connect with me if you have any questions.